Thank you for joining Putting Your Cloud Strategy on Solid Ground. Our presenters will be Brent Ellis, Senior Analyst with Forrester, and NTT Data Vice President, Practice Leader for Cloud Services, Emily Lewis-Pinnell. This discussion will be focused on cloud strategy research findings that will help you define the keys to your enterprise cloud strategy, and insights from NTT Data Services that will inspire your advancement in navigating to the cloud. I will now turn it over to Brent Ellis. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you, Tammy. Hi, I'm Brent Ellis, Senior Analyst at Forrester Research, and we're here to talk to you about putting your cloud strategy onto solid ground. Now, since 2006, when AWS first opened its infrastructure services up to public consumption, cloud migration has been a tantalizing option for businesses looking to accelerate both time to value and to decouple costly CapEx investments from digital transformation projects. New, better ways of consuming cloud have been born as many enterprises tested and refined their cloud adoption efforts over the course of the last 15 years. Today, we're going to look at some of those cloud adoption modernization strategies and the best practices that have bubbled to the surface for your cloud strategy. Now, at Forrester, we are told to kind of put the cart before the horse and show you what the end product is before we get to all the things that lead to it. And so what you're seeing on the screen right now is kind of where you want to be in your cloud strategy. You want a good mix of corporate practices, partner engagements, data, cloud elements, all tuned to constantly improve your customers' experiences. Now, in reality, that sounds like good business strategy, but why is cloud strategy different? So that sounds like just good business strategy, but why is cloud strategy different? One thing you have to realize is that when computers were introduced into businesses, we had businesses adapting to computers rather than really focusing on their end users itself. So you had a huge infrastructure built around technology in order to enable computing use. But cloud is an abstraction from that infrastructure, delivering business capabilities and allowing businesses to refocus on delivering value to humans, your employees and your customers. And those fundamental changes into how your business runs require a coherent strategy to be successful. When we talk to customers at Forrester about their cloud strategy, we look at four basic questions. What should the goal of your enterprise cloud strategy be? What is the taxonomy to characterize those platforms and services you're going to use? What can be done in cloud with regards to major practices? What's the art of the possible? And then what types of partners will really help you accelerate that journey and maximize value? We sum that up using our cloud strategy fundamentals model. And it's really looking at your partners, practices, and platforms working together to optimize both customer experience and employee experience. Because ultimately, value for your business depends on good human experience. Now, looking at some of the data that Forrester's collected over time, generally most companies are looking to do a combination of two things. One, remove themselves from the infrastructure business. And two, and most importantly, is increase velocity and time to value for technology-related initiatives. If you look at this graph, at the top, we have ability to scale quickly and easily. And that has actually bubbled to the top since our 2020 data, where that same selection was at 37%, and now it's at 41% of all infrastructure decision makers, decisions for driving for the cloud. With any big change, there's going to be challenges. And some of the top challenges for moving to the cloud involve training, security and compliance concerns, migration cost, availability of apps and data during that migration, hiring experienced cloud experts and partners, organizing personnel and work to support the changes needed, existing application architecture and the hurdles that brings, performance issues in the cloud, latency, and then holding on to staff that you've trained and upskilled. Emily, I'm curious if NTT Data is running into the same sorts of challenges, or do you see more of them out there?
No, yeah, this definitely aligned with the challenges we've talked about with our clients and we've seen in the market over recently. We actually did a research paper about this a year ago, calling out really similar challenges out there. And I think one point I've talked about quite a bit with clients over the last 2 years is this extent to which not all of these are technical problems. I mean, that is the technical training and grappling with technology is a real issue. But when you're thinking about, not just hiring and growing, but also figuring out an optimal work structure and retaining people, those, that's where the people really gets in the organizational structure really gets into the core of ability to execute with the technical changes you're making with a choice to unlock the cloud.
Yeah, and that personnel retention is one of the reasons that in our cloud fundamentals model, we actually call out EX as one of the things we want to optimize. Definitely. Because employee experience is how you retain employees. And it's a huge cost to find good talent these days. So those people that you've upskilled and kind of trained on your cloud model, you want to be able to keep them and keep them happy.
Yeah, and there's a reality that the minute you have trained somebody and let them work for about 30 seconds on a cloud project, their value just went up in the market. So people have to be realistic about that as well.
Exactly. We really want to focus on how you can overcome these hurdles. And that starts with identifying what the hurdles are. Number one, you really want to identify a compelling event that says, why modernize now? And in 2020 and into 2021, the answer to that question for a lot of companies was the pandemic itself. But without such a large external compelling event, businesses and technology leaders really don't like taking on these long, expensive, risky projects. For your own business, examples of compelling events might include, a competitive threat. Maybe you have a board level directive, demands from new customers, or just a general mandate to innovate faster. Second, it's really hard sometimes to find where to start. And you can't run a race like this if you can't find the starting line. Our clients tell us that identifying where to start a modernization issue is one of the biggest challenges they have. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was on a call with a really large company that you probably all know, but I don't have the ability to disclose right now. But they were really asking, where do we get started as we modernize our infrastructure so that we can become, a better service for our end users? And just picking a place and moving forward is one of the hardest problems that these people have. What we've seen is core systems like billing and demand operations that end up touching the end user are great places to start because you get value from, providing value to your customers, and that raises the likelihood of executive support for the initiative generally. Lastly, you really want to align your modernization efforts across that people, platforms, and practices columns that we saw in the model earlier. Cloud these days is just code for contemporary software architecture, containerized deployment, on-demand services, and pervasive automation. But for the dev teams and the AD&D leaders that have to implement cloud technologies, it requires mastering three really big challenges at the same time: adding new talent, selecting platforms and services, and then adopting those nimble, quick software delivery practices so you get the velocity that your business wants. All this is really difficult, and businesses benefit from the expertise of experienced cloud partners who've gone through this journey with similar organizations. Now, for those companies that have hit their modernization journeys and they've done it successfully, we really see four primary strategies. Building new apps, migrating existing workloads, modernizing legacy apps, or buying and customizing a SaaS service. But decision makers are really doing all of them at once. And from the graph here, you can see that there are 6 different bars, and the top 2 are really kind of this modernization effort and changing the services you have in order to deploy them into the cloud. The middle 2 and the bottom one are different types of lift and shift or direct migration efforts. And then the one second from the bottom is building new cloud native apps. But people are doing all of these things at once. And of the 5 different options for modernization, they really kind of break into 2 categories. At the top, you see kind of our incremental transformation patterns. That's the ones in light blue. And then the bottom 2 are more radical transformations. Emily, does this line up with what you're seeing in the cloud, kind of like these 2 basic breakdowns and then these different approaches?
Absolutely. And then we also speak with clients about how all those different approaches can line up in terms of the investment cost to execute against the ROI you're expecting to get out of it. And to your point about companies doing them all at once, typically recommend looking at them on an app by app basis in terms of what's the business value you expect to get out, and let that drive the decision about what the right migration path and adoption path is. So for example, a business revenue generating old legacy application that has tremendous value to unlock a lot of great, new revenue streams, better customer experience, more responsive customer service, whatever, really drive business value is a great opportunity for one of the more modernization transformations, and a bigger investment in doing it, or even a complete rebuild on the bottom. Whereas lesser investment on things you expect to get lesser benefit out of. So that decision needs to be made based on the business value of what the underlying, application is actually doing, not just what it's sitting on.
Right. And, we might get to this a little bit later, but I imagine that that's different for almost every company, like which applications get moved in what way and in what order.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are trends, like you just said, about targeting those business value apps first. And when we talk to some of our large Fortune 500 clients, it's very interesting to look across the landscape and different business units and different groups within it. Because I will talk to one client that I've seen them up on stage at reInvent, touting all that they've done, and they've got some really great flashy stuff that's been built. And you know what? That's the customer facing apps that they've built and stood up entire organizations around and rebuilt from scratch from what they used to have at tremendous investment and cost, but tremendous return to them as a business. And then I'll talk to other parts of that same company and that same organization and, go in the door thinking, they're going to teach me everything. And turns out this is a different group, and they're kind of putting their toe in and thinking through stuff, and frankly, very different returns on any initiatives they make, driving very different decisions about what should be done. So it really is critical to have the business context as well as the technology context around everything.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into some of the detail on these approaches so that we can give people an idea of what they're in for. Now, number one, and this is kind of the easiest to do, but you get the least amount of value with regards to your cloud strategy, is the lift and shift. This is where you're taking an application, whether it's virtualized or containerized, and you're moving it directly to a service in the cloud. And you're not really making any changes to it. You're not improving the customer experience, and you're not improving the application's user interface. Now, usually people are doing this approach because they have a time-sensitive need to either move out of a data center, or maybe there's a licensing change for a particular piece of software, and they just want to be able to move something quickly, and they don't have the time to refactor or modernize the application. But we at Forrester recommend that you make sure that you come back to this application and you look at it as a target for refactoring or rebuilding in order to get some of that cloud native boost out of it. Do you have any examples, Emily, for groups that you've worked with that have been driven to a lift and shift model?
Definitely. Lift and shift, it's the black sheep of cloud migrations at this point. And rightly so, because I've unfortunately talked to a lot of clients who frankly thought they were getting the Ferrari and expecting a big new modernized whatever, and only paid for a lift and shift. And that's what they got. And there is a disconnect between expectations and results, and they didn't see all the savings and flexibility that they thought they would, because it turns out just moving an application to the cloud and running it the same way, relatively little benefits you get there. But to your point, when speed is important, and we have any number of clients that have come to us looking for help as part of a divestiture, is the most common example, and they're on a clock. They need to get their IT out. And typically those are, I can't think of one that isn't less than 6 months that they need to move. We have one that I can think of, we did in 89 days. And so
Wow.
That's a lift and shift, get it moved, and then think about what you'll be doing later, because any slips are problematic. And the key thing is to be able to keep the business going without interruption with that very fundamental move that you've made. We actually went through that ourselves, a few years ago with the divestiture we had of entity data services acquisition of Dell services. The other thing I'll call out is with clients that are doing a broader cloud transformation, where, as we just talked about, we go app by app on what makes sense for each one. There's plenty of apps out there that, if the goal is just to get out of the data center, because that's an overall we're trying to exit, there's a certain percentage of apps that aren't going to benefit from a lot of change and don't need a lot of investment. And just a simple lift and shift strategy is the right one for those specific apps, although not for the overall migration.
Yeah. And, one example that I have kind of is a warning is a client that I used to work with did a wholesale migration of their infrastructure into the cloud, including their dev environment. And then they started getting the bills, and they were just much larger than they expected. And what it came down to is in the dev environment, they just weren't shutting it down when they weren't using it. So being able to pay attention to that cost optimization piece is also a really important thing.
Yeah, I think there's that gray area a bit between what is a pure lift and shift, and I really just don't even think about anything, versus, at least pay attention it's in the cloud and have a little bit of right cloud management strategies, because those are the worst case scenarios of all, where they didn't do any of the basic unlocking the underlying platform that they could have had. And that, I don't consider that the limitation of a lift and shift. I don't know about you, but I think at least taking advantage of managing your time at utilization and so forth is something anyone needs to do within any cloud migration.
Right. Let's look at number 2. So number 2 is a modernize then move movement. And so this is where you do all of that modernization on-prem, and then you migrate it into the appropriate cloud service. One of Forrester's clients that we interviewed when looking at these different approaches, they went and modernized all their core apps. They repackaged them as containers, and that really set them up for that transition to public cloud. And then once they were there, they really accelerated their modernization efforts. So they were building new web applications natively for the cloud, and then deploying, functions as a service to the tune of 8 million different FAS functions. Now, the end result was they retired somewhere on the order of 6,000 on-premise systems. They closed an entire data center, and they had an overall budget reduction after cloud costs were figured in of around 9%. And the next thing that they're really looking to do is to move to container orchestration and adopting Kubernetes or some other tool in order to be able to deal with those containers in the cloud more elegantly. Anything from NTT data that you'd add around this modernize then move approach?
Yeah, absolutely. This is when you start getting into really unlocking the benefits depending on the app. And we've worked with clients. We have an app modernization practice that focuses entirely on this for high value apps, and taking what they've been doing historically and really unlocking a lot more value on it. Going all the way, going over from a basic, restructuring of the application from a microservices perspective. I guess that's not really basic, but getting all the way up into mainframes and successfully having modernized mainframes and moving them into the cloud. So this is where you really can start seeing tremendous value for taking the right business case and the right thing that you're trying to accomplish and making the investment to unlock that. I'd say the other thing that we've recognized as a caution in talking to clients that have struggled with this is recognizing that this is also when you're looking again at a fundamentally different way of working. If you're trying to redo an entire application, trying to get it to be more microservices, and your goal is to have more flexibility for the business, but you have existing teams that were managing the old stuff, right? So this is a case where you start having dev and ops needing to be working together in a different way than they were traditionally. And where I've seen this succeed is where this is a strategic goal that is being led across those teams and planned for across those teams. Talked to a client yesterday who's doing a great job of thinking through and progressing what they're doing app by app, and saying that we're going to move to the cloud once we're done with this piece of work right now is their plan. On the other hand, I've talked to cases where that alignment and that cultural, crossing the chasm of those leadership teams has not come together. And that can lead to stalling out on anything for a long period of time. I know of one client that, in all seriousness, I've talked to them different times over a 4-year period. And they basically remained stuck in a early testing mode of a couple of pilot apps for 4 whole years, with finger pointing back and forth of we need to move in the cloud, the ops team saying that they weren't modernized and ready to go yet, and just stasis that they couldn't organizationally break out of, and finally managed to get some change management in there to get that solved. But that's the type of thing to be sure to looking at how the end use case requires people to start strategically partnering together different than they might be used to.
Yeah, and that piece you just talked about, dealing with the organizational silos and adjusting how you work when you adopt cloud, is so important, because it's not just the technology, it's that the way you work with it is different and the goals of it are different. And you really have to move to that agile and DevOps mindset of breaking down silos, working iteratively, and also working in product teams and having everyone talk. It's you can't kind of operate with a clearly divided dev and ops team once you start moving things to cloud.
Definitely.
So let's look at number 3. So at first glance, the move then modernize approach seems like a lift and shift with a planned modernization at the end. But what we found when we were doing client interviews is that most often, these are people that had some sort of platform as a service or PaaS tool, Cloud Foundry or OpenStack on-prem. And what they're doing is migrating that to the cloud and then doing further modernization to adopt things like Kubernetes orchestration or dividing things to cloud-based services. So it's not quite the same as a lift and shift. It's really you have some capability in-house and you're moving it into the cloud directly, and then you're doing further either modernization or refactoring. Is this does this sound like what's happening with your customers too, Emily?
Yep, absolutely. In fact, we brought in a company called Flex7 about 2 years ago now, and specifically because they were early drivers of exactly this type of a migration path, and we were starting to see an increasing need for it amongst our enterprise clients as they started advancing beyond the basic lift and shift. And taking, not without having to get into the code itself, but taking the application, moving it over, and then having the teams restructure to start thinking how they can take advantage of it going forward, and seeing a lot of benefit. And again, this is another one where the business benefits are really what you start saying when this is done well, but there's also operational benefits too, in terms of, I've one client I'm thinking of that we know that they reduced their development time by 80% once they were able to go over into a cloud model. Yeah. And a different one, another example, they had an 80% cost reduction in their analytics that they were executing, which was really core to their business. So definitely see the cost element as well, but then the business flexibility.
So next up, I just wanted to point out that containers are really a key component of modernization efforts. I know that I've mentioned containerization on a couple of different slides so far, but if you look at this bottom bar, this is kind of like currently what projects people are planning or currently using containers for. And that dark green, that 30% is existing modernization projects. So 30% of the respondents were currently using containers for their modernization projects. For new projects, 37%, and then both new and existing projects, 32%. Now, when you looked at then 1 year and in 2 year, you see a bigger bar for new projects and a bigger bar for both new and existing projects. But part of that is that they expect to have a lot of that modernization done by then. But if you look at it, there's a significant portion of enterprise IT decision makers that are already using containers as part of that modernization approach. So let's go ahead and move on to number 4. So the replace with SaaS. Now, what we're seeing is most core enterprise SaaS vendors provide a much better end user experience. And they also relieve the burden of kind of managing infrastructure and the software from the business itself. From my perspective, though, businesses really have to choose wisely, because you want to make sure that you are adopting a SaaS platform that pays attention to cloud native technologies. They're using APIs and microservices as part of their platform. And then they're exposing that to you as the user so that you can derive additional value down the line. At Forrester did something called a total economic impact study recently. For adopting kind of core enterprise SaaS, we were seeing a return on investment of between 30 and 55% for companies that were replacing, core infrastructure and business process applications with enterprise SaaS tools. And if we move to the next slide, you can see like what some of those tools are. And just looking at the data for every one of these segments, around 40% of business already have transitioned to some sort of SaaS product. And so we're talking about order management systems, sales ops tools, supply chain management, sales enablement, enterprise resource planning, portfolio and project management, human capital management, procurement software, finance and accounting software. So these are major parts of your business, but a lot of times they're not directly interacted with by your end users. They're buying these tools, and a lot of times when those tools were on-prem, in order to get value out of them for your business, there was a significant amount of customization that happened. And I've talked to a lot of IT leaders that was a huge headache, because then that system would have an update and they couldn't actually move to it because of the customization. But a movement that happens more in SaaS, when you have that API layer, when you have a cloud native tool, is you're able to compose between multiple different SaaS tools or services that are already hosted in the cloud, new experiences and new and innovative ways with dealing with your data. Sometimes that means that you're exposing an interaction with your SaaS platform to your end user. Salesforce is actually pretty spot on with this, with the way that they extend their platform with multiple integrations. Think about like the DocuSign integration with Salesforce, for instance, so that you can send a contract to a client, have them sign it through DocuSign, and then it gets attached to the opportunity directly within your Salesforce instance. And that's just an extension that doesn't actually break Salesforce if you need to update to the next version, but it extends the capability so that you're getting more value out of the platform after it's customized. Just another pattern we see happening when you have this SaaS environment that's cloud native is the opportunity for citizen development, extending functionality through low code tools, APIs, function as a service, in-house built containers and more. So with those different patterns, Emily, like, is that something that your customers at NTT Data are getting value from as well?
Yeah, we've definitely seen the same pattern of getting comfortable with letting go of the customization, and where that can be, the trade-off is acceptable. And I've been in this business long enough to remember when there was a lot of concern about that, and it's becoming easier and easier. I think the other pattern we've observed is the extent to which industry-specific SaaS applications are taking off. We have a really strong vertical focus in our business. So we've got the horizontal SaaS platforms, most of which you just showed on the previous slide, starting to see more and more adoption coming in with like Duck Creek, for example, in insurance, and more platforms that we're having to proliferate, to extend our specialization in different platforms to support our clients with, to get into needs they have specific to their type of business, as the extent of that standardization is extended in terms of comfort and use cases to get into things that aren't totally generic across all businesses, but start to be more niche specific for an individual vertical.
Excellent. And finally, rebuild. And if you remember all the way back to the slide about what infrastructure leaders are choosing, rebuilding your application from scratch is the one that probably people do the least amount because it requires so much to do it. But businesses are, and they do, completely rebuild their applications. They break down existing monoliths. Sometimes those are on mainframe or x86 systems inside your data center. And they're really kind of looking at the various services of those applications and moving them to appropriate cloud services, breaking down the APIs, figuring out whether or not they're still valuable. And if they're not, moving them out of the system and recreating or reimagining something new. And this really helps to modernize how a business uses an application like this so that they can derive additional value in the future. Emily, if you have any good examples of, clients that have done this entire reimagining of a core app, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, and these are very much the revenue generating apps driving this scenario, right? That's when it makes sense, because they can see the value of something totally new, unlocking new revenue streams that they weren't getting into before. So I think the new and innovative mobile apps and really expanding the customer experience from that perspective is the single biggest example I see of this. And again, great numbers that we can see out of that. And what's interesting is how much of it is business value numbers, in terms of not just talking about deployment time and testing time, although we've seen good results in those dropping quite a bit from what their legacy apps were doing, but literally saying we've generated X dollars new revenue, and those results that they're generating is what they're able to show. And that's what's really exciting with this particular use case.
Awesome. And if we go to the next slide, so finally, here's just kind of a quick table of the pros and cons of modernization approaches. And as you can see, all of them have some sort of benefit. But really, it's those last two, the radical transformations, that you get the most value from doing the change. And one thing I want to point out, mainly because one of my key areas of research is around resiliency, is that for the 5 approaches that we're talking about here, 4 of them, the enterprise still owns the responsibility to make that platform resilient. And it's pretty clearly on the enterprise's plate to do that. But number 4, that replaced with SaaS, there's sometimes some fuzziness with regards to who's responsible for your data. Most SaaS providers are upfront about application resilience and making sure that their applications are available, but not all of them are protecting the client data. Some key instances where they are HR apps, where I think the buyer, that VP of HR, really wants a service that is compliant with whatever they need from a personnel data management perspective. But some apps don't back things up at all, and some just expose an API or a backup layer. And it's really important for enterprises to know upfront what they're responsible for with regards to data hosted in those SaaS applications, so that they can either assemble the services to back that data up, negotiate with the vendor to build backup and archiving into the contract, or assess and assume the risk of using that system without a data backup in place. I'm kind of curious, Emily, how does NTT apply these different approaches? And then with regards to resiliency, how do they address resiliency in cloud-centric operations?
Yeah, so we tend to approach all of them when dealing with clients, particularly clients that are going through an overall transformation and modernization program, which we do have. So we have a mix of spot projects, which are coming in saying, and those tend to be the 4 after number 1. So, right. Coming in either gradually doing move that improves and over time, or particular target apps that they're either modernizing and moving, or completely rebuilding, or replacing, and going on those one by one. Or we have clients who are coming in with an overall modernization strategy, and we're going through their entire footprint and coming up with what is the strategy for each app across these different types of approaches. And again, tying that back to the business value as well as how that's used. And you're bringing up resiliency, though, is a great call out, because frankly, both that and we're seeing security have come to being, a decade ago, all the conversations I would have about our AWS migration would be all of these risk concerns that our clients were concerned about in terms of, well, it's good for an app, dev environment, but I can't really run production there. And at this point, with, following the well-architected framework, the ability to really build resiliency into your business critical applications at the cloud level is itself a benefit of the move. It does require, again, not necessarily lifting and shifting, because I've been on that call too, where, we had to point out that, or not we, but they're sitting there while the unfortunate IT team was pointing out to the CIO that he had declined to do any resiliency and pay for some redundancy within an application. So that's why it's currently down. So that needs to be thought about, but it definitely can be built in there, just like following the best practices can drive security often above what people are able to do on their own.
Definitely. Well, to wrap it up, building value with cloud native technology requires businesses to take the time to build a cloud strategy that are focused on the fundamentals of platforms, practices, and partners. And the goal is really to optimize that tech stack for an improved human-focused experience. So you're looking to get from the model on the left-hand side into that end state on the right-hand side, where all of your cloud practices are tuned at improving your customer experience. And by the way, improving your employee experience is part of that model as well. So with that, I thank you for letting us present our model to you. If you don't mind a couple extra questions, if Tammy, you want to go back to the slide before. I'm kind of curious, what are the ways that NTT data really helps organizations use cloud to focus on that human element of their organization?
Yeah, with NTT data, we actually have an entire business thinking about workforce management and change management, as well as another one entirely focused on customer experience. And so we've been able to tap into those two histories of consulting talent to sort of infuse it within this entire subject of what we're trying to get in terms of outcomes of cloud adoption. So first of all, as we've talked about, so much of the business value that can be generated out of a more flexible application running in the cloud is contingent upon that customer experience. And we look at the success in trying to get to these outcomes as requiring experience and expertise and joint cooperation across talents, including the cloud platform side and those SMEs, application development side, and the CX side of driving the overall design of what's needed out of the application, and bring all of those together to try and optimize, as I said, all those business values and the business results, rather than just thinking about it operationally in terms of everything. Operation cost matters too. And so we definitely have folks caring about when we're able to move the needle there. But what's really more interesting and compelling when we can talk to business stakeholders and not just the IT stakeholders is when we're able to move the needle with the customer. And then from an internal change management perspective, just as we were talking about, a couple times so far in the last hour, how it impacts the people in terms of figuring out how to work differently in a DevOps model if you've taken and transformed an app. And we certainly have observed where that can instill a stasis if it's not driven methodologically, and where we've seen clients who have gotten kind of paralyzed in their migration because of the inability to break out in terms of how they're working. And so taking that change management approach to driving new ways of working, really helping mentor and guide DevOps adoption is something we get a lot of demand for, because that basically ensures that they don't just get a new toy and not know how to play with it, but they're ready to run with it in the future as well.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's this like change adoption curve where it talks about, people encountering change. Like first they resist, then they like explore options and they accept it or something. But one of the things I remember from this particular seminar that I was seeing is that people hit that curve at different points, especially like different groups of people within the organization. I'm kind of curious, in all the different cloud migrations that NTT Data has done, what have you learned about helping people get through that change adoption curve in order to make things like cloud migrations more successful?
That's a great question, because that kind of epitomizes the last decade of cloud growth, right? In terms of the early adopters and where they've been able to drive organizations faster than others as well. And you can only move as fast as your organization can move. So different levels of risk tolerance amongst our different client sets. And we span a lot of different verticals. So we have a really broad range of maturity we've seen across our client sets, with people who were out there trying everything the first time and really building up a ton of stuff and hiring people out of Seattle and figuring it out, to people, other organizations that are just putting their toe in. And within every one of those, there's been a variety of embracing across the team for sure. And these are adoptions where the wrong person as a detractor or just a negative obstacle can definitely derail things. So alignment within senior leadership deciding, that are responsible for the outcomes here is essential, and care and thought around how the activity is actually rolled out within the organization. One of the other kind of change management things I read about over the last few years was going back to like the 60s or the 70s or something in terms of management theory around the idea of organizational inertia, and the fact that there isn't just necessarily detractors or people who are uncomfortable, but just the stasis of a big organization. When you get beyond the individual, everyone might be on the same page of, this sounds like a great idea, but just simply knowing how to do things in a different way and being comfortable that you're doing things in a different way requires a lot of focused direction within the organization. Otherwise, people will just revert to doing what they know to be successful over time. And so in particular, when you're trying to change like a DevOps model of working, it does require a lot of force and effort and strategic focus to instill the new behaviors across the organization, not even because of active resistance, but just because of being comfortable in what people should be doing day to day when it starts looking different from who they know to be interacting and what the expectations are of how I work with you. When it changes, that needs to be really requires some strategic focus to instill those new agreements of how people work together.
Awesome. Who knew that technology would be so focused on humans, right?
I know. I like to say that in all of this, one of the things we bring to the table is we've got great technical experts, and they bring down the risk because they've done this stuff before. They know how to do it right. They make it work. But at the end of the day, I also think the technology is hard, but it's not the hardest part.
Great. Unless you have something else that you'd like to add, I think we're pretty much at time.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Brent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Talk to you later.
So Brent and Emily, thank you so much for sharing your insights and thought-provoking perspectives. And to you, our audience, thank you for your time. And please be sure to look for an email from us, NTT Data, that will offer a free access link to the in-depth report on Forrester's cloud strategy fundamental model. Have a nice day, everyone.